Russia, of course, sees Starlink as a legitimate military target. They haven't acted against that as far as we know. The investigators, victims' families, I think they're absolutely right to be outraged. They haven't gotten the justice or the truth that they're deserved.
Is the real scandal behind 9/11.
If your mom's a deputy director at CIA and your dad's a 15-year Navy veteran who now runs a cybersecurity firm, and this is where you end up, there has to be a high degree of rebellion at play there, right?
Basically, it becomes kind of fertile ground when you're exploring its alternative spirituality to end up siding with Russia.
Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Espresso Martini. Matt, how are you?
Doing good, Chris. I got my State Department hoodie on.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Straight from the, well, not recently, but came from the gift shop in the basement of the Truman Building. Just kind of felt like the vibes today. Did you hear the news? I forgot to mention this to you a couple seconds ago when we were getting set up. Did you hear the news?
Which news?
It's like news. Like just like I was turning my camera on and I had my phone in the other hand and I'm just sort of glancing at it and I see that Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor, and his deputy, Alex Wong, are leaving the White House. And of course, this is news to us. It will not be news to you, dear and gentle listeners, on Saturday. But
yeah, wow. I wasn't expecting that to happen.
I don't know, sort of we'd planned this to be a Trump-free episode this week, and so maybe we'll leave that to fester in the corner until next week. But
yeah, I think it's an awful lot to say, other than I suppose it was probably bound to happen at some point. With regards to Signal Gate and his endless signal groups that he had set up and things,
and the Loomer stuff, and
somebody had to take the fall over it. And I wonder if where Hegseth's situation is now. If Waltz is gone, then what happens next? Is he the sacrificial lamb?
Good point. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is one of those interesting, like I'm talking to you about this right now, and like I'm knowing, like when people hear this, they're going to know so much more than we do right now.
Yeah. Yes, the future selves will be like,
yes, silly. No, this is why they left. Yeah, so we'll get to that next week. But yeah, literally, just as I'm turning on my camera, I'm like, oh crap, he's gone.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I hadn't seen that, so thank you for drawing it to my attention. No, that's crazy. But no, when you said if you heard the news, I was trying to think about which news. Because I heard about the minerals deals just being signed. I still have mixed feelings about really how effective that's going to be.
Maybe we'll get to that next week also.
Yeah, I'll probably have a look at that next week. So quite a lot to talk about next week.
Just sort of shove it under the bed, way in the back of the closet. Try to forget it for a couple of years. Yeah.
Well, it's unfortunate because we were trying to have a Trump-free episode. I was planning not to even say the word. So.
After this, it's all we got nothing on him.
No, hopefully not. No,
not really.
So, not really. No.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I will get us into, we have some interesting stories today, aside from obviously the Signal Gate thing that's just crept up on us. But today we'll be talking about rising tensions between India and Pakistan following a deadly terrorist attack in Kashmir. Then we've got newly surfaced evidence that reignites questions over Saudi Arabia's possible links to 9/11 attacks. We've got a Russian satellite linked to nuclear weapons development that is reportedly spinning out of control. So as we speak, it's spinning away. And then the son of the CIA's deputy director is killed in Ukraine fighting on the side of Russian forces, which is quite an interesting one, that one. So our first story is about the rising tensions between India and Pakistan, which obviously is developing. And there's even a possibility of some sort of a retaliatory action on India's part.
Yeah.
But Matt, I'll let you tell us a bit about what you've got there.
Yeah, this is another one of those things that by the time you guys hear it, you'll probably know more than we do right now. But it does seem like it's
important. I thought it's worth talking about. Yeah,
could happen while we're recording this. We'll see. But so here's some details on what's been going on. So Tensions are once again rising between India and Pakistan following the deadliest terrorist attack in Indian-administered Kashmir in years. On April 22nd, gunmen opened fire at a popular tourist resort in Pahalgam, killing 26 people in an assault that shocked the country and reignited one of the world's most dangerous rivalries. Within 48 hours, India and Pakistan had canceled visa access, expelled diplomats, and closed their respective airspace to one another's aircraft. New Delhi accused Islamabad of harboring the attackers, and although Pakistan has denied involvement, it hasn't eased concerns that a new military clash may be imminent. India has reportedly been weighing limited airstrikes, similar to its 2019 cross-border incursion into Pakistan, after a similar terrorist attack which saw Indian fighter jets cross the line of control and target what it described as a militant training camp. This time, the Indian aircraft carrier Vikrant is operating in the Arabian Sea, having arrived there before the Pahalgam attack, but now loitering off the coast as a contingency. A senior Indian military official told the Times of India that a variety of military options, short of full-blown war, remain on the table, and that any retaliation would come, quote, at a time and place of our choosing. Pakistan, for its part, has placed its forces on full alert, launched live-fire naval exercises, and issued warnings that any Indian airstrike would be met with a decisive response across the full spectrum of military power. But alongside the saber-rattling, Pakistani officials have also made gestures toward de-escalation, including a call for a third-party investigation into the Kashmir attack, and public remarks highlighting the fragility of Pakistan's recovering economy. The only thing we need right now is a peaceful neighbor, said Pakistan's ambassador to the U.S., even as his government braced for possible Indian military action in the coming days. The broader concern is that both nations are nuclear armed, with a long and bitter history of conflict over Kashmir. The region has been a flashpoint since partition in 1947, and while both countries have avoided full-scale war since their last major confrontation in 1999, they've skated dangerously close, most recently during that 2019 clash when dueling airstrikes and a brief aerial dogfight brought them to the brink. Analysts say a similar pattern is unfolding now, a limited strike followed by a symbolic response. But the risk, as always, is that something escalates unintentionally or that political pressures on either side push events beyond the point of control. For now, there's no sign of broad military mobilization from India, but cross-border fire has already resumed along the line of control, with Prime Minister Narendra Modi vowing to pursue the perpetrators to the ends of the earth. The pressure to act is growing. What happens next, and whether this turns into a brief exchange or something more dangerous, may depend less on intentions and more on how well both sides can manage the risks they're now rapidly running. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, obviously worrying. Tensions and possibility of a serious conflict between Pakistan and India is concerning, especially at this time with the war in Ukraine, conflicts and tension between Israel and Palestine, and ongoing global tension caused by uncertainty around the new US administration's global priorities, as well as this sort of new axis between Russia, China, and North Korea. So having a war with India and Pakistan, even though a full-blown war is probably unlikely, it's still worrying. And global tension is very high, and if we're not careful, things could really boil over. The latest tensions over this terrible terrorist attack, which left 26 dead, was linked to the Resistance Front, which is known as TRF, and they're believed to be an offshoot of the Pakistani-based Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is LET, and they're one of the most prominent jihadist groups with well-documented links to the Pakistan's inter-services intelligence services. So, I find it a little bit problematic when Pakistan say thoughts and prayers to India when they might well have a hand in all of this. But we'll go into that a bit more in a minute. So tensions between India and Pakistan primarily stem from this long-standing territorial dispute over the Kashmir region. When British India was partitioned in 1947, Kashmir was a Muslim-majority region, was given the option to join either India or Pakistan. Its ruler chose India, which Pakistan opposed, and that's led to the first of several wars between India and Pakistan. Since then, both nations have claimed Kashmir in full, but only control parts of it, leading to frequent skirmishes and periods of heightened military and political tension. And then obviously other sources of conflict include cross-border terrorism, water disputes, and deep-rooted mistrust that's all made more dangerous by both nations being a nuclear power. Looking at the major powers who back Pakistan and India, so looking at Pakistan, Pakistan has strong geopolitical support from China and a developing relationship with Russia. Its relations with the US are currently sort of in decline. The current US administration has paused military and civilian aid. India has mixed support from Russia and the US. Russia is a historic ally of India, but US relations are getting stronger. The UK has strong diplomatic relations with both and is currently a major development donor, providing funding across education, health, climate, and humanitarian areas. The EU is also a trade partner of both India and Pakistan. And then Middle Eastern support. Saudi Arabia is a traditional ally of Pakistan with the UAE and Turkey, and then Iran is seen as a cautious neighbor with Pakistan. India, meanwhile, has strong strategic ties with the UAE and growing relations with Saudi Arabia, but it has limited support from Turkey and a tense relationship with Iran. So I just wanted to kind of give an idea of some of the kind of geopolitical kind of forces should some terrible conflict kind of happen. And it's likely that obviously the US would probably provide India with diplomatic and intelligence support, whilst China might likely back Pakistan and give them diplomatic, logistical, and intelligence support should there be a major war. Whilst the UK probably more likely call for diplomatic a diplomatic kind of end to things. So we'll see how this sort of plays out, really. I'm hoping it won't lead to full-blown conflict. I think that's unlikely because of the nuclear question.
Yeah.
This is not the first time this has happened. I mean, the last time tensions grew to this level was in 2019, which was after a suicide bombing which killed 40 Indian paramilitary personnel in Pulwama, Kashmir, and the attack was claimed by another group called Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is also a militant group based in Pakistan. So there's a bit of a pattern here. Pakistan unfortunately has played a recurring role in igniting tensions with India, often through its support of militant groups like LET and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which have carried out high-profile attacks on Indian soil, including the 2001 Indian Parliament attack, the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which was JET, and then the 2019 Pulwama bombings, which you just mentioned. And then these actions have sometimes been linked to the Pakistani intelligence services, and they tend to often provoke a strong and often immediate response from India, including cross-border surgical strikes and airstrikes and targeted militant camps, which is what happened in 2019 and might even happen today or later this week. So, anyway, Matt, I'll hand back to you because I've been yammering on a bit there, but there's hopefully some interesting stuff there.
Yeah. So just to sort of start at the top here. So Pakistani nuclear doctrine, I believe, calls for the use of nuclear weapons. They're like, red lines. Calls for the use of nuclear weapons if a portion of its territory is occupied or if its air force is destroyed. And none of that. We're still several rungs, quite a few rungs down the escalation ladder from anything like that. From what we know and what we see right now as we're recording this, it does not really seem to be on the horizon, to be honest. I mean, it seems certain that there will be some Indian response. I mean, I believe it was yesterday, a Pakistani official came out and said their intelligence estimates say that, there will be a Indian strike, limited on facilities, camps, madrasas. Also, as we were just sitting down to record this, I saw a thing on my phone that Pakistan closed a good number of its religious schools for the next few days out of fear that they could be struck by India. So it does seem, it could be by the time this episode is we're done recording this or at any time thereafter, but probably, by the time y'all are hearing this, it'll have already happened to some extent. All indications, though, I mean, as you've said, point to, limited strikes on Pakistani terrorist targets. I mean, it really rings to me. I know how you feel about this. It rings to me of those few rounds of, kinetic diplomacy, I'm saying with air quotes, that we saw between Iran and Israel last year, like days or even weeks in Iran's case of, we're going to do this at a time and place of our choosing. And, like it's coming, and this is sort of, there's these leaks and these rumors and these sources that say it's going to be along these lines or whatever. And you have plenty of time to get your Patriot missile batteries in place and, scramble your fighter jets across the Middle East. And, like it's not going to be a surprise. Whatever you don't want to get hit, move out of the way. And that's if you really want to hurt somebody, if you really want to do damage, you're not going to do that. So that's sort of where I fall on that right now.
It's almost a bit pointless and performative, isn't it? Because yeah.
Sure. I mean, I would take that from the alternative of what we're looking at here.
Yeah.
Pakistan is making noise about de-escalation. Also, the Indians, for their part, have said last night I saw were saying that we have a plan, and it's not going to be like a knee-jerk response, and it's going to be very sort of like calibrated and deliberate, and we know exactly what we're going to do. And that's, to me, is like very, everybody chill. Sort of like, okay, Pakistan, you got to take this one on the chin, and that can be it, which is very much how those exchanges between Israel and Iran last year went. I mean, it was dangerous, of course. The risk for escalation and miscalculation, and one missile lands somewhere where it shouldn't, and you're way off to the races. But so Pakistan is making noise about de-escalation, and seems, like I said, ready to take this one on the chin. Once India attacks, of course, the ball is in Pakistan's court, and what happens next is largely up to them. And if they're saying, we don't want to escalate, we're kind of concerned about our economy recovering, and we don't want to screw that up, I think the writing's on the wall as to what their move's going to be. So everything I'm reading here is there's no appetite for bloodshed. However, of course, the threat of escalation or miscalculation between two nuclear-armed countries, both of which have long hated each other, can't be dismissed. I'm not panicked by this as of this recording, and I don't think listeners should be either. But like I said, it's serious, it's worrying, it's another sign of how dangerous and unpredictable the world is. Things happen gradually and all at once. Events that were once unimaginable suddenly become all too real, often before we fully understand the events that made them real. I mean, great powers like to think they have the luxury of responding only to the crises of their choosing, and that they're writing the script, but they're not. No one's writing the script.
No, and they're, I think both of them have a lot to lose. Like, as India's economy is very much rising at the moment; it's doing well,
Yeah.
and they've even got there's some big summit going on. I saw called Wave. I'm not quite sure what that is, but there's something big going on at the moment involving kind of celebrities and things kind of currently happening in India. I think from an Indian point of view, I think they'd have a lot to lose if they got kind of bogged down in some dreadful open conflict. So I think Modi, is a bit of a strong man. So I think he needs to project some image of some sort of like retribution, and I can kind of understand some element of that, because you can't let this sort of action go unanswered. But but is an airstrike the best thing? Wouldn't it be better to try and hunt down the people actually responsible and then try and bring them to justice, or and actually bring those networks down, or I don't know. There's
would require an invasion of Pakistan, though, perhaps.
Well, yeah, unless you can find a way to, I don't know. Yeah, this is an ongoing dispute since 1947, so it's definitely not going to be an easy answer to get out of that one.
Yeah, they've been at this for a while.
Yeah,
Hatfield and McCoys of South Asia.
Exactly, and whoever does solve it, there might be a Nobel Peace Prize for them, but I don't think we're in the running for that one. But what was kind of interesting from Pakistan's side was how they were calling for an independent investigation. And I find that a bit weird, considering I think it's most likely that their intelligence services via LET and then this TRF group somehow, the TRF is sort of a proxy for LET. And so I don't know, it's interesting, that call for an open inquiry. Is there a level of confidence they've got enough degree of deniability over it? I
don't know remotely enough about this part of the world offhand to sort of go into details. I was saying to you in our notes, this would be a good place to speak with an actual expert on the decades long conflict now. But it seems like in recent years, following the last few rounds of attacks on India from Pakistan, that Pakistanis have kind of cracked down a bit on the Islamist groups in their midst a bit. I'm sure that is debatable depending on who you ask, but that's kind of the read that I got a bit. It's an olive branch. I think it's really just them saying, okay, you got to do what you got to do, but like we're not trying to pick a fight with you. And that to me is like if you're going to get hit and you've already decided, you're not going to swing back. You're going to
Mm.
kind of take it and walk away and let it be. Then of course I think the fight's not going to um devolve from there. But we'll see. It's two nuclear armed countries, and it is a very dangerous, risky situation. The one thing though, and this is a big deal, so we won't go into it too much. India suspended the Indus Water Treaty in response to this attack, also, which Pakistan called an act of war. But so that's a water sharing agreement that was signed in 1960, brokered by the World Bank, and it basically dictates the sort of eastern and western tributaries of the Indus River, and Pakistan, I believe, has rights to the western tributaries. And of course, if India cuts them off, it causes all kinds of agricultural and humanitarian issues for Pakistan. So that's something that I think, like, if I was on the staff of the NSC or in the State Department right now, that's something that I think has to be fixed, like, immediately. That cannot last. That's a problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And do you think there's enough people in the State Department these days who kind of understand the significance of that?
Yes. I don't know how worried they are about, polygraph tests and having, random, like, big balls from Doge checking their resume for loyalties and stuff, so they can't really focus on that. I will say, though, I mean, we weren't gonna, I'm gonna try to mention him as little as I can. Trump and Modi seem to have a pretty healthy, decent relationship. One of the few world leaders who Trump does have a kind of, good, productive relationship with. Of course, Vance's wife is an Indian American. His children are part Indian. I think that could be an asset in terms of, reaching out and try to get dialogue going.
Well, and Pakistan has the history of harboring Osama bin Laden, which never helped Pakistan in the eyes
No,
of the US,
no,
especially as America gave significant and still did give significant aid until the current administration paused the aid. But
yeah. I think that divorce was kind of a mutual one after a while.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah, no, yeah, very complicated kind of
Hmm.
situation. But I think, thank you for bringing it on, because I think it was well worth discussing, because I think, I'm quite keen with this show to always not get too, because we've been a bit bogged down with the current administration, because so many things have been going on. And I'm always quite keen to kind of keep an eye out on what else is happening right now, because
I know it's.
yeah, because there was even another terrorist attack a few weeks prior to all this that kind of is connected, that we kind of ended up not talking about at all. And I've it's been so long, I've actually forgotten the details of it now. But yeah, so there's all sorts of things kind of going on between India and Pakistan at the moment, and so I think it's good to kind of put it out there. So thank you.
Yep.
Well, let's take a break, and we'll be right back with more. Welcome back, everybody. So our next story is about new evidence that's come to light, which once again raises serious questions about Saudi Arabia's possible involvement in the 9/11 attacks. So CBS News via 60 Minutes have shown some new evidence that suggests a man named Omar al-Bayoumi, a Saudi national once dismissed as an unlikely extremist, may have been an al-Qaeda facilitator who supported two 9/11 hijackers. Without his help, experts say they may have been caught. A video filmed by Bayoumi in 1999, recently unsealed in court, shows surveillance-style footage of key Washington landmarks, including the Capitol. It raised suspicions that it was a pre-operational kind of intel for the 9/11 plot. The FBI and CIA were reportedly unaware of this video for years, despite it being recovered by British police in a raid in 2001. And obviously, it shows a major intelligence gap that former investigators call deeply frustrating. Other seized material includes a sketch of an airplane and a mathematical formula that experts believe could calculate a plane's descent to a target, further fueling doubts about Bayomi's claims of innocence. Bayomi's close ties to hijackers, including housing them, giving them banking help, and introductions to other people, raises major questions about Saudi Arabia's role as the 9/11 family's lawsuit against the kingdom moves forward in U.S. federal court. So, Matt, what are your thoughts on this one?
It is true that we've never had a proper, honest accounting and reckoning for the involvement of perhaps certain royals and other prominent Saudi figures in 9/11. And unfortunately, I doubt we ever will, if I'm just being honest.
Mm,
Our relationship with Saudi Arabia was then and is now too complicated and important to allow perhaps simple and obvious moments of clarity like this, which seems kind of crazy, but that's how it is. I mean, Saudi culture and politics, the kingdom's global brand has transformed dramatically, even in the last 10 years. And I think that's made our relationship more complicated, even, and not in ways that have strengthened our hand with them. So for instance, Biden came into office under a lot of pressure from within his party to put the screws to Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, on a host of issues beyond just 9/11. So that's international corruption, especially in sports, um, human rights abuses against South Asian laborers, the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, most of all. But then gas prices got ridiculously high coming out of COVID. Normie Americans were not pleased about it, and OPEC wouldn't boost production. Mohammed bin Salman is sort of the guy who says if OPEC says boost production, OPEC boosts production. Um, China came sniffing around the Middle East for bases and investments and arms deal, and Saudis are kind of a very attractive potential customer or buyer right there. So we also wanted to cement a Saudi rapprochement with Israel, which would have opened a wealth of opportunities on Palestine and Iran and the whole Muslim world. So realpolitik prevailed again. All the while, God only knows what MBS and his new buddy and business associate Jared Kushner were talking about in their Signal or WhatsApp chats, and that's another thing we'll probably never know. So in a way, I mean, I think Biden's failure to check the Saudis early on previewed many of the struggles he had once confronted with realities of governing. But I mean, as far as this is concerned, the investigators, victims' families, I think they're absolutely right to be outraged. They haven't gotten the justice or the truth that they're deserved. They've been thwarted by their own government and the legal system at every opportunity. It's so unfair, and sadly, I just don't see that changing. Maybe one day, but I don't see it on the horizon. What about you, Chris?
yeah, no, it's you painted perfectly the complications of the kind of real politics of it. It is the real scandal behind 9/11 and
Yeah.
ultimately the actual conspiracy that's going on. Whilst nutters talk about all the nonsense of 9/11, this is the actual probably true story that's yeah, rather worrying, and we may not even know the truth until, another 20, 30 years or beyond.
Could be like this, like the JFK files that got declassified. We're sitting
Yeah.
here how many
Well,
decades
yeah.
removed, and we get little bits of information that have been redacted in government archives for decades.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned JFK because after he was shot, one of the concerns of the US government at the time was that obviously an event like that, is a bit like they equated it to the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand and the start of World War One.
Remember about Cuba?
And obviously 9/11 was a significant terrorist
Mhm.
attack, a lot of lost lives, a lot of anger, understandable anger.
Oh yeah.
And the Bush administration very carefully moved that anger away from Saudi Arabia and pushed it onto Iraq in the end. Obviously, it channeled it through Afghanistan and the hunt for bin Laden. But ultimately, I think they kind of exploited that anger, and that led to the Iraq invasion. I don't think, I don't know how you feel about that, but it's
Well, the way you bring that up, it sort of reminds me also the way in which some people talk about the question of whether Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union, rather than giving them back to Russia, and the different situation we would be in right now. And we've had this conversation. I think it was on the last season of this show where I said, people forget how serious and scary that non-proliferation issue was back at that time. Of loose nukes or radiological material falling into enemy hands. And I just don't, we're not talking about Ukraine right now, really, but there were real concerns that, Ukraine was not suited to safeguard this material. And I think looking back at it now, 35 years, removed, it seems very kind of neat and tidying with the benefit of, history and hindsight. It's, well, of course we should have done this. But, if you think back to that time, it was not that certain. It was not that cut and dry. And I mean, I remember I was a kid, I was in middle school, but I remember 9/11 that day. I remember the immediate aftermath of it, and, thinking like, the vibe, the discussion that I recall, and of course I was, 11, so my, processing of it is different than it would be now, but just remember, like, the vibe was, we're gonna go country to country, taking these people out until terrorism is gone, which is also like, terrorism is a tactic, It's like saying we're gonna get rid of people getting run over by cars, like, no, you can prevent it in places. You can enact policies and, designs and stuff to, like, lessen it from happening. But, like, people are always, as long as you have cars on the road, you're always going to, like, terrorism is a tactic. You cannot exterminate like a tactic. But that was very much the mindset at the time. And to that point, the Saudis were, for the Bush administration, were a crucial partner in getting inside Al-Qaeda from an intelligence standpoint. And also, the Al-Qaeda branch that was operating in AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that was operating within Saudi Arabia at the time. I think this was 2003, I think. There was a series of terrorist attacks across within Saudi Arabia. That was by Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's the security situation from Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia at the time was a concern. I don't know that it was going to be like an ISIS situation where, like, they would have just, toppled the government and just taken over Saudi Arabia. But it was a real concern. So to that point, looking back at the time period where it's like, okay, you're with Bush and his war council up at Camp David, right after 9/11, and you're planning out the opening moves of the war on terror. Do you want to go after the people who are currently harboring bin Laden right now? Or do you want to spend all this political capital going after a, large middle power, regional power that's at that point sat on a much bigger percentage of the world's energy reserves than it does today? And, like, do you want to push the envelope with them, or do you want to go after the people who are, like, actually directly responsible, operationally behind it? So, and I think, looking back, the victims' families and investigators and stuff who feel like, we never gotten to the bottom of this, and there are people like the man who you mentioned who got away free. I think that's entirely valid and stuff. But again, I would just suggest that put yourself back in that moment in history. It was not that clear, and I can see how there was that fork in the road and why we went the way we went, or didn't go the way that we didn't go. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
It does. And I think, it's a cautionary tale, because obviously, if the US government did know more about Saudi Arabia's involvement and the letting on, obviously, number one, there's a huge, it's a huge breach of trust between the government and the public. But at the same time, if the government had been honest with the public and there'd been a call for an open war with Saudi Arabia, an invasion of Saudi Arabia, or whatever, that would have been America attacking the heart of the Sunni Muslim world, which would not have symbolically gone down well at all, and if anything, would have played directly into what bin Laden wanted, because he...
the custodian of the two holy mosques.
Yeah, because bin Laden effectively wanted to create a holy war between the non-Muslim world and the Muslim world. He wanted to topple the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So this is the interesting thing where I have an issue with believing that Saudi Arabia institutionally backed bin Laden.
Yeah, I don't believe that. Yeah.
No, because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had as much to lose from Al Qaeda as anybody else.
Yeah.
I'll give some context, because there might be some people who don't really understand Saudi Arabia's role in Islamic extremism. So I do my best to kind of explain some things. So for decades, Saudi Arabia has played a key role in spreading a strict and ultra-conservative form of Islam known as Wahhabism. And in following the 1973 oil boom, the kingdom used its vast wealth to fund mosques, religious schools, and Islamic organizations across the Muslim world and beyond. So like certain mosques in the UK are funded by Saudi Arabia. Usually the mosques funded by Saudi Arabia are usually nice and pretty.
When I my flat in London, there was a mosque like right across the street that was pretty sure was a Saudi mosque.
Ooh, where were you in London?
It was Kilburn Park.
Kilburn Park. Okay.
I think I could hear the call to prayer every day. I used to love listening to it. Yeah.
Yeah, but so yeah, through these efforts, Wahhabi ideology promotes sort of religious purity. It rejects innovation and often views other sects like Shia Islam and Sufism with hostility. And it became a global force. While not inherently violent, Wahhabism laid the ideological foundations for many extremist movements by encouraging intolerance, rigidity, and a rejection of pluralism. The export of the ideology became especially influential during the Cold War, when Saudi Arabia, backed by the United States, financed the Afghan jihad against the Soviet Union. Go watch Charlie Wilson's War, you'll see a bit about that.
Yeah.
And, fighters trained in Saudi-funded madrasas in Pakistan and would go on to form groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So over time, Wahhabi-influenced networks helped incubate a worldview that justifies jihadist violence. And it, included the later rise of ISIS. So while Saudi Arabia did not directly create these groups, it helped build the ideological and financial ecosystem they grew from. And in recent years, the kingdom has taken steps, like you were talking about earlier, to distance itself from hardline clerics. But the legacy of Wahhabi influence on global extremism remains deeply rooted. Now, the 9/11 Commission report, they officially, back in 2004, cleared Saudi Arabia, saying found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials funded Al-Qaeda, but the report also added the conclusion did not exclude the likelihood that charities with significant Saudi government support diverted funds to Al-Qaeda. Let's not forget 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi citizens. And so my putting all that in now, so my kind of thoughts on it are, I wonder if there were members of the Saudi intelligence community and members of the government who ideologically sided a little bit with Al-Qaeda or even greatly with Al-Qaeda and kind of went a bit freelance, and they abused their position.
Yeah.
Kind of used the resources of the Saudi government to do things without kind of official sanctioning. That's my suspicion.
Same as Pakistani ISI.
Exactly. So yeah, there's a particular guy called Brigadier Ijaz Shahar, forgive my pronunciation there, and he's one example. So the US and Indian intelligence suspect Shahar shielding extremist networks and then using them for ISI operations, and that includes liaison with Al-Qaeda figures. And obviously, Shahar was also allegedly the handler of a man named Omar Saeed Sheikh, who was the British Pakistani terrorist who kidnapped and killed the Wall Street journalist Daniel Pearl. So this is one of the interesting things with regards to Pakistan as well. Has a very iffy relationship. The ISI, which is the Inter-Service Intelligence Service, is not to be confused with ISIS, which has an extra S at the end. Totally different organization. They do use these terrorists for all sorts of different sort of ends. But again, the question, I think with Pakistan, there is a bit more evidence to suggest that certain administrations have allowed the ISI to do what they did.
Yes.
But with regards to Saudi Arabia in 9/11, because the kingdom itself was threatened by bin Laden, I don't really understand how the government would sanction, back that bin Laden guy. I think that's a great idea.
Well, also consider the kind of balance of power in
Mm,
Pakistan between the military and the ISI versus like the civilian, shall we say, government,
yeah, yeah,
way mismatched. ISI and the military sort of does what they want and they sort of tolerate the civilian government. It's a very different story in Saudi Arabia and always has been. The royals, they got that under control. But that's not to say, of course, that there were certainly, I don't think it's in dispute at all that there were and potentially still are, I don't know, people within Saudi intelligence, the military, probably not the National Guard. I think that's very well vetted that are, sympathetic to Al Qaeda's ideology.
well, definitely, and there were people within the ranks of various Saudi organizations who would love to see the royal family deposed so they could become the president themselves.
Yeah.
Let's not forget political ambition.
It would be the emir in that case with the Wahhabist coup, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So all those sort of factors can play into it as well. So a very complicated picture
Yeah.
forms just there. So, so sadly, I think who knows what the actual truth is, but my suspicion personally is I think it's sort of rogue elements within the Saudi government abusing their positions of power to facilitate things.
I just want to make one point here to be totally clear so I don't get
Yeah.
like nasty messages or anything. I am not suggesting that, okay, if the US intelligence community knew or does know more about the involvement of certain factions within the Saudi security services and their involvement with Al Qaeda at the time of 9/11, if the US intelligence community does know that, I'm not suggesting that they were right to not force that issue with the Saudis. I totally understand why people would be outraged by that. I am merely saying, calling attention to the complexities
Yes.
and the sort of chaos and nausea and anxiety of that time and trying to sort of illustrate why that may not have happened at the time. And now, what are we now? 24 years removed? Geopolitically, we just don't have that. We don't have that hand to play with them anymore. We just don't.
No. And that's the sad thing about what was that this theory? The more people who get murdered, the more complicated the case becomes,
Yeah.
and the more political it is. And so then, finding the suspect and arresting them becomes even less likely. And then there's even like with the Lockerbie bombing, I've met people who are 100% convinced that they got the right man, whilst there are other people I've met who are 100% convinced that there's more to it than meets the eye. I actually have no idea what the real story is, and that's the problem with these kind of cases, because there are always so many moving parts within it. When it's I think it's I don't think anybody really disputes the Libyan government was responsible for Lockerbie.
Yeah, good idea with that.
But it's just like the individuals who were tasked with carrying it out, there's some debate over. And I'm not in a position to answer either way of who it should be, because the people I've spoken to give equally compelling cases. So that's probably for another episode, the Lockerbie bombing. But that's the thing. I think when there's a geopolitical angle to a terrible loss of, large loss of life, it becomes much more complicated and murky. And sometimes, if the truth does come out, people are not satisfied with it because it's not necessarily as big as or dramatic as they thought it might be. So it's a funny one.
Yeah, and that's normal human behavior. That's a normal reaction.
Yeah.
People have that for all
Yeah.
kinds of things, big and small.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Was there anything else you'd like to add, or are you happy?
No, really,
No.
yeah, interesting story. It's always interesting when it, every couple of years it seems like it pops up a little bit for a moment. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed, and I'm sure there'll be more stories to come. And I definitely want to do some more interviews around sort of the 9/11 case. I've always wanted to get Ali Soufan on, and the only reason I haven't is just I have to reread his book, and it's just like with the amount of books that we do read for the current interviews that we got, is that I need to sit down and take out some proper time to reread his book because he's written 2 fantastic books. In fact,
Yeah.
my favorite book on the War on Terror is The Black Banners, which was
Yep.
written by Ali Soufan. I think that's fantastic, and it does talk a little bit about the British side of the 9/11 investigation. So I think it even goes into the raid that might have led to that videotape.
I could also do a couple episodes on Saudi politics and their security services. I have a bunch of books
Oh,
back
yeah.
here against the wall
Please
about it too.
do.
It would be good. It would be good double research duty for the novel.
Cool. Well, let's take another break, and then we'll be right back with more. Welcome back, everybody. So our next story is a very interesting one about a satellite that has weird allegations about it might have a nuclear weapon on it, which I don't believe is the case.
I don't think that's the case.
Matt, you can tell us all about that.
So we've talked about concerns about this satellite before, but not as explicitly about the satellite itself. So, a Russian satellite that's been a focus of U.S. intelligence concerns appears to have malfunctioned in orbit, casting fresh light on Moscow's ambitions and setbacks in space-based warfare. Cosmos 2553, the Russians love their numbers.
They do. Are they actually sequential?
As far as like the other satellites and stuff?
Yeah.
Probably. I don't know the numbering system. Anyway, I digress.
Sorry.
Cosmos 2553, launched just weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, has been tracked for over a year by commercial firms like Leo Labs and Slingshot Aerospace, both of which detected erratic spinning and signs the satellite may have lost control. While it now appears to have stabilized, U.S. officials believe Cosmos 2553, though itself not a weapon, is tied to Russia's development of a nuclear anti-satellite, or ASAT, system, potentially designed to disable or destroy entire satellite constellations like SpaceX's Starlink, which Ukrainian troops have used to coordinate battlefield operations, and Moscow has called a legitimate military target. The Russian Ministry of Defense insists the satellite's mission is benign, aimed at testing instruments in a high radiation orbit, but U.S. defense officials say that claim doesn't match the satellite's behavior or trajectory. The satellite has been operating in a relatively isolated orbit about 2,000 kilometers above Earth, deep in a zone few communications or Earth-observing satellites traverse due to high cosmic radiation. U.S. Space Command has acknowledged changes in the satellite's altitude and says the inconsistency between Moscow's stated purpose and its observed activity increases the risk of misperception and escalation. While the full extent of Russia's anti-satellite capabilities remain unclear, Cosmos 2553 serves as a vivid reminder that low Earth orbit is no longer a neutral zone, it's a potential front line. And so this satellite is, so it was last summer that Mike Turner, who was then the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, made a big stink in the press about Russia putting nukes in space and everything, and he was really concerned.
Yeah.
That was this satellite.
I remember now. Yeah, because I think I said this before. It reminds me of the plot of the Clint Eastwood film Space Cowboys.
Yeah.
You know, because that film's all about these old guys who are sent out to disarm a nuclear-armed Russian satellite, which obviously is reflective of kind of Cold War anxieties, etc. I don't think the Russians ever actually put a nuclear weapon in space as far as we know.
No.
I think it's very unlikely.
I don't think that's ever been done as far as we know.
No. There's been nuclear reactors because there was a Cosmos 954 was a nuclear-powered satellite that then, it kind of crashed, and it led to radioactive debris spreading all over parts of Canada, prompting extensive cleanup efforts. So that wasn't good. And, you know, with all this sort of speculation in the press about whether Cosmos 2553 might be nuclear armed, you know, is sort of blown things out of proportion, and maybe even a bit of a misunderstanding about this sort of ASAT system, you know, which is sort of part of Russia's sort of campaign to be able to basically knock out military satellites, isn't it? As far as I understand, they want to be able to sort of detect military satellites and have the capability to destroy them.
Right. Well, that's any anti-satellite system. This one is much more like you're a spoiled kid who's losing at Monopoly, so you flip the whole table over and stomp off to your room. Is sort of that's
because the debris. If you blew up if you blew up, if you detonate a device in space, it will cause all this debris. There's so much crap in space floating around the Earth right now. If you watch
Kessler syndrome,
gravity, that's it.
Kessler syndrome, yeah.
And it could mean we wouldn't be able to actually put any rockets in space for decades.
Yeah, I can go more into that in a second if you
yeah. Well, the only other thing I was going to say was that there is this sort of wider concern that this has brought up about, you know, whether a nuclear weapon could be detonated in space, and whether this is the beginning of a new kind of nuclear arms race in space, because people are concerned that there might be nuclear weapons put in future satellites. And I think people are right to be concerned about that. And there probably needs to be some sort of international discussion about these things, because if you do detonate a nuclear device in space, not only does it lock us kind of into the planet, it would create a kind of, create an EMP blast that would knock out power and all sorts of things, disable satellites and communication systems. Even Elon Musk's SpaceX will probably collapse under that. And apparently SpaceX is a legitimate military target, according to Russia. So,
yeah. I don't know why everyone's just being so mean to Elon. I don't know why it's just it's so unfair. Everyone's
Poor
so mean
Elon.
to him. He's done nothing but just bring, joy and happiness to the world. Why would you blow up his satellites? That's so mean. That's so mean. He only has $200 billion left.
I know. I mean, he could have a very bad week. He could get kicked out of Tesla, and then somebody blows up SpaceX. It could be a very bad week for Elon Musk.
You ever be like a couple days away from like the direct deposit hitting your checking account, and you're like, man, I'm really strapped for cash. That's how Elon must feel with only 200 billion to his name.
Wow, gosh, yeah, 200 billion. Wow, wouldn't that be a nice sum? But anyway. So
I would still do this. Podcast.
Oh yeah, totally.
I'd have a much better studio, but I still do.
Oh yeah, we would actually have people who edit this for us and do the marketing and everything, But anyway, that's a whole other thing. So Matt, what are your thoughts on this sort of nuclear satellite?
So Cosmos 2553 isn't a space-based nuke, to be clear, but it might be laying the groundwork for one. So the satellite was launched, as we said, just after Russia invaded Ukraine, or just before, I should say. And it's operating way out on the edge of low Earth orbit, in a dead zone of elevated cosmic radiation that almost no one else uses for this because it's radioactive. That isolation makes it harder to track, and a lot more convenient for experiments you don't want anyone watching. There's fleets of satellites that the Russians have, that we have, that China probably has also, that sort of like snoop. They're like spy satellites in space that like watch other satellites. It's very cool. So from what we can piece together, I think this looks like a test bed, not a weapon, but a system designed to study how a satellite behaves in high radiation environments. Think of it as maybe like the orbital equivalent of those like 1950s test towns at the Nevada test site, like just mannequins and appliances and then a blast wave. But this one's 2,000 kilometers up.
Yeah, they want a level of survivability for their satellites, I guess, don't they? And they want to see what they can.
Yeah, they want to test it in a scenario where there's lots of high cosmic radiation, as you would get perhaps if a nuclear weapon went off in space. So the nightmare scenario with a nuclear ASAT system, as we were sort of describing earlier, isn't one satellite getting knocked out. It's knocking out entire constellations. You're not just hitting Starlink, you're blinding or even shredding every communication, surveillance, and early warning satellite in that orbital range. And that doesn't just burn up and go away. This is the Kessler syndrome. So one thing breaks and shatters, and then you have all this shrapnel, flying around the Earth at thousands of miles an hour, and that collides with other satellites. It causes them to shatter, and then it's more debris, and it just keeps going and going and going. You're left with this cloud of debris screaming around the planet, like I said, at thousands of miles an hour, making space itself unreachable to all of humanity for years, perhaps decades. That doesn't just, it's not like, the Death Star blowing up where that just burns up in the atmosphere and the Ewoks kind of dance and cheer and hooray. It doesn't work like that. So Russia, of course, says this was just a science mission, but it's hard to square that with the orbit choice. U.S. officials and civilian analysts alike have pointed out that the altitude isn't ideal for electronics testing, unless the goal is to monitor long-term degradation in a dormant nuclear payload. So if you have a nuclear weapon based up in space and it's sitting there for years, and you don't want to have to send up Clint Eastwood and I forget the other guy in that movie to fix it, you test it here now. So that would make sense if you're designing, like I said, a nuclear ASAT system that has to sit up quietly in orbit for years, and then you want it to work properly the moment that it's needed. The timing also raises some interesting flags. I I mentioned, the invasion of Ukraine. Russia, of course, sees Starlink as a legitimate military target. They haven't acted against that as far as we know.
I think it's unlikely they would. That would be pretty, yeah.
Now, yeah, for sure. Yeah, they're not going to do that
Mm.
now. So they're making progress in their own capabilities, but they know they can't match the U.S.'s capabilities conventionally, so they go asymmetrical. And this is, I mean, we're talking nukes here, so it's hard to square that with asymmetry. But they build a bomb that wipes the board like the, Bond villain Putin is. If we wanted to really speculate, the satellite's recent tumbling, spinning out of control before stabilizing again, could have been caused by a fuel problem, a thruster issue, maybe even a supply chain compromise with some bad chips or other components. That's not impossible. Intelligence agencies have done it before, slipping faulty components into adversary systems. Hezbollah's exploding pagers are an infamous recent example. Iranian nuclear technology has been sabotaged in this way too. Mossad breaking into, specific warehouses all over the world. The broader point here is that we're still operating in the dark. Space weapons development is deeply classified, and that makes deterrence hard. You can't deter in the black. I've said that on here a few times. We could credibly promise mutually assured destruction during the Cold War because everyone knew generally what the other side had. Thousands of nuclear tips, ICBMs ready to go if you tried anything. With space, right now there's no baseline understanding, at least without a top secret clearance and being read into a SAP, just suspicion and guesswork. And to a degree, that's dangerous over time, especially as we shift toward, like, as you're saying, massive proliferated constellations like Starlink, not just for the internet, but potentially as the backbone of military ISR. So if each of those thousands of Starlink satellites becomes a sensor node, and right now Starlink has over 7,000 satellites in low Earth orbit right now, you've got you've soon got 24/7 ubiquitous global surveillance. It's that unblinking stare, right? At any point on Earth, indefinitely, if you want to. So Russia knows it can't hide from that system if it tries to shift personnel and equipments to the Baltics, let's say, or sail a ballistic missile sub into the North Atlantic. They know they can't defeat it conventionally, so to stop it, they might just cripple the entire species. That's the pressure driving this arms race.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, the whole asymmetric thing, because, yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking about it, it's like, the US spends billions on putting all this stuff into space, but if you can't defend it and actually use it, it's almost a bit of a waste of money.
Yeah,
So that's where the whole Space Force thing comes in.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's like I've said it here before. At first, like when Space Force was announced, I was like, that's silly. We don't have TIE fighters.
Mm,
Why do we have a Space Force?
yeah.
But no, I was completely wrong. It makes complete sense to me. I think having a separate service branch, increases the budget that you get. Focus. You don't have to share space-based projects with the Air Force people that are doing F-47s. Because it's a separate service branch. But yeah, there's all kinds of stuff up there right now, and more stuff going up all the time that um, bodyguard satellites, and we're talking about those, satellites that kind of snoop around and see what other satellites are up to. There's so much going on up there, and we barely know even the beginning of it.
And that secretive shuttle, was it X-36B? I always get this wrong.
The X-37B.
Oh, get it wrong by one digit.
Close.
Do we know whether it can, like, grab and take a satellite out of orbit? That's one of my suspicions of its capability, but
It has a bay that opens with an arm that can reach out and presumably grab things. And
Mm.
what it can do with that arm is, I could tell you, but I would have to kill you.
Could it be like You Only Live Twice, and that spaceship that comes along and grabs the satellites?
Yeah, it would be so the responsible thing, rather than you could set off a nuke in low Earth orbit and destroy everything up there, or you could have the X-37B kind of slide up and take its little arm, its little hook, and pull a satellite out of orbit or nudge it off course a little bit, and it sort of drifts, falls back down into the atmosphere and burns up, and you're just taking out that satellite and not putting the species back into like the 40s.
Yeah, indeed. Well, this is obviously again another kind of ongoing story. So we'll see how that develops, or whether it comes crashing to Earth. I don't know. So might be coming into your garden this time next week.
Maybe.
But what would it be like having a Russian spy satellite land in your garden? What would happen?
Who would you sue for that?
I don't know. It's an interesting one, that one. That's a good question. Maybe a listener could answer that.
Yeah, any lawyers listening, let me know.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to our final story, which is a bit of an odd one. It's not a particularly cheery story, but it's all about the deputy director of the CIA's son who was killed in Ukraine fighting for the Russians, not the Ukrainians, the Russians. So Michael Alexander Gloss, a 21-year-old American son of CIA Deputy Director Julianne Gorlina, was killed in April 2024. So it's a little while ago now, and the news just broken. But he was fighting under contract for the Russian military in eastern Ukraine, according to independent Russian media. So Gloss reportedly signed a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense in September 2023 and was processed at the Moscow Military Recruitment Center used for registering foreign fighters. It's interesting that they have a whole center for foreign fighters, but anyway. And his name later appeared in a leaked Russian medical database. And he was deployed in December to the 137th Airborne Regiment based in Ryazan, which is an assault unit that was active in combat operations near Soledar in the Donetsk region. And he was killed on April the 4th during those operations in 2024. His remains were returned to the United States 8 months later, and his family obituary said he died in Eastern Europe, but did not mention the war or the countries involved. Gloss grew up in Virginia in a military family, was active in the Boy Scouts, and participated in university groups focused on environmental and social issues. In recent years, he reportedly grew critical of US foreign policy, particularly in relation to the Middle East, and became interested in travel and activism abroad. In 2023, prior to his time in Russia, he volunteered in Turkey following the earthquake there. Friends and acquaintances say he began expressing interest in Russia during his time overseas and eventually traveled to Moscow, where he joined the military before his visa expired. It remains unclear whether Russian authorities were aware of his family background, but I suspect they might be. The CIA has declined to comment on the case, and there's been no confirmation from US officials regarding the details of his enlistment or death. So, Matt, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, this is a really bizarre story, and I don't want to get snarky about this kid's political beliefs or what he thought he was doing, because this is still a human tragedy that caused this intelligence officer and her husband their son. But I mean, wow, what a complicated situation. I think it's a story of online radicalization and
Yeah.
horseshoe theory in practice. Honestly, I mean, I believe he said in certain posts and everything that he was fighting fascism. Um, but I mean, and also likely mental health as well. I mean, I don't know what 21-year-old American guy of sound mind goes to volunteer for the Russian army in Ukraine, or at least, I think they wouldn't do that.
There is reporting he was taking medication that he stopped taking prior to his
Right.
travels to Europe. So whether there's something there, I'm not sure, but yeah.
And, that's not to suggest, of course, that, Michael didn't have agency here or was just fully a victim of internet propaganda in some way. I mean, he made the choice to do this. I mean, yeah, it seems there was a mental health factor there also. He dropped out of college in 2023 and lived in Turkey, supporting earthquake relief there, as you said, before traveling to Ukraine. So I wonder how much contact his family even had with him in those last couple of years.
Yeah, from what I saw of the reporting, so iStory were the people who published this first, and I was a bit skeptical because it was a Russian sort of run publication, so it instantly set off an alarm, because originally I thought iStory was connected to The Independent, because The Independent's called like iNews or something online, and I had to double check myself about this story. But in the so iStory is an independent Russian media. It's not a Russian propaganda outfit, from what I can tell, and I think it's run from Latvia by people who are critical of Putin. And so there's quite a lot of detail in the iStory item, and so he did have sporadic contact with his family, but they never knew exactly where he was. He went to a gathering in Georgia and attended something known as the Rainbow Family, which is a kind of countercultural
environmentalist
movement inspired by Woodstock. Yeah.
far left environmentalist, like commune or something.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about the online radicalization is sort of spot on, because when I was reading this and looking at some pictures of him, so there's a picture of him flipping the bird at the US Capitol building. There's a picture of him where he looks like he's a character out of Lord of the Rings, which apparently is connected to his clothes being stolen, and he managed to cobble together something that made him look like Gandalf, but which is bizarre.
Okay.
But it kind of it all was a bit familiar to me, because I mean he was a young man, and I was like, in my own personal experience, when I was like 22, 23 was when I fell into 9/11 skepticism. That's how young I was, and older than Michael was. Michael obviously went on this sort of journey himself. It sort of started with, as his father described, he was the quintessential anti-establishment, anti-authority young man. So it's kind of probably where that journey began. And he was a very sensitive young man as well, from what I gather. And I think that combination of ultra sensitivity, questioning America's role in the world, etc., which is understandable, and it's not to say that questioning America's a bad thing, but I think it's only a bad thing if it leads you to going and fighting for Russia. But I think so. Basically, it was just a kind of cocktail of things going on, and then his friends mentioned that when he got to Turkey, he was getting more and more into kind of conspiracy content and watching more and more conspiracy content online. And he had a bit of I get the impression he had a bit of a sort of spiritual side to him, and I wonder whether some of the conspiracy content he was watching was kind of connected to so basically it's this sort of shared spiritual belief in Russia, which I'm going to go into in an episode next week.
A lot coming up on this.
Oh my goodness, yes. It's all about, so I'm going to butcher this completely here, but if you watch the interview properly next week, you'll get it. But there's a shared kind of spiritual ideology between Ukraine and Russia that has its roots in paganism. And all those sort of things, those pagan symbols and things get kind of co-opted by counterculture. And then so basically it becomes kind of fertile ground when you're exploring its alternative spirituality to end up siding with Russia. And I've seen this happen before, because a friend of mine from my conspiracy days was very much the hippie, very much like Michael was described.
Yeah.
And has ended up becoming like pro-MAGA, pro-Russia. And I'm like, how did this happen? And it's all through his journey of like, my friend, he was into David Icke. And it went from sort of David Icke, Alex Jones, to then Russian propaganda online, etc. And it kind of led to this sort of weird cocktail of belief. So I wonder if Michael went on a similar journey.
The MAGA movement, for a lot of people, whether it's true or not, represents, and in some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't. The MAGA movement, for a lot of people, represents a rejection of the traditional establishments, right? The kind of, normal world order, the old guard, the way we do things, norms, procedures, all that kind of stuff, So does that, I can see, I mean, I don't know, you have much more personal experience with that sort of conspiracy culture and that mindset than I ever did. But I don't know. I sort of see that. I think also, like, I was thinking last night that, if this had happened 10 years ago, if this happened in 2014 or 2014 or something, that, I don't know, could he have ended up in Syria fighting for ISIS instead? I mean, I remember there were a lot of foreign fighters who got interviewed in Raqqa and stuff during like the height of the caliphate. And there was a lot of horseshoe theory at work there. Those guys, their beliefs were all over the place.
Oh, yeah. I think it starts with a rejection of your own culture. And it kind of goes on from there. I think it with people who go out to Syria and fight for ISIS, etc., I think usually those foreign fighters have rejected the kind of Western way of living and think it's corrupt and blah, blah, blah. And then somebody has filled the gap with the alternative, but those individuals don't question then the contradictions of the alternative.
Right.
And so, because if Michael really questioned then his support for Russia, I mean, Russia's been involved with some horrific things.
Right.
And still is. And so it's an interesting kind of intellectual kind of leap to end up going from anti-establishment and anti-America to then being like pro-Russia and pro the invasion of Ukraine. But when you kind of get involved in these conspiracy things, I think it just it's sort of a slow burn that kind of leads you to thinking that Russia's somehow the savior of the world in some respect. Because, like, we talked about before how Putin likes to present himself as the savior of the white Christian world.
Yes.
I think also with regards to this sort of pagan thing, there's some other stuff that's sort of in Russian culture that are being sort of used and exploited to tap into American countercultural movements. So this is why I always sometimes wonder, like, with regards to conspiracy culture, how much of it sort of some of the stories stem from Russia a little bit through Russian psyops information, things like that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so it's a very complicated thing, and I think it's made me think I need to dig into it some more because there's a really good podcast called Conspirituality that talks about how the spirituality movement and conspiracy movement are kind of merged, and it leads people down these weird paths where they do end up becoming either MAGA or do end up being very pro-Russia and pro-Putin, etc. And I've witnessed it through people I know. I've never witnessed, thankfully, anybody kind of go as far as Michael did.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just sad that he ended up on that journey because now, there's a family about a son. As his father said, he hoped no one got hurt by Michael. And from what I've read, I think Michael might have ended up in some sort of medical unit of the military in Russia, but I don't know. But it just shows how, people's sort of personal crises can end up hurting other people if you're not careful. And we have to keep an eye out on the ones we love, really, don't we?
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just speaking also to that kind of, psychology there, I think if your mom's a deputy director at CIA and your dad's a 15-year Navy veteran who now runs a cybersecurity firm, and this is where you end up, there has to be a high degree of rebellion at play there, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, how can I be the most unlike my parents? How can I most stand up against what I think they represent? And what happens seems like a very kind of logical extreme. Let me go the farthest away from, what they do and who they are as I possibly can.
Indeed. And like with people who end up sort of in ISIS and things, I mean, I haven't seen this anywhere, so I'm just totally speculating here. But just thinking about Michael's background, it's not out of possibility. Could he have been groomed in some way through conspiracy culture online? Could he have been targeted in some way? It's possible. Well, it's not. I don't know how.
Yeah.
If that's the case, but it's certainly there's a possibility there.
What bothers me, and this is sort of, I mean, all I kind of have on this, but what bothers me is knowing that there are certainly some Russian intelligence and military officers who got a sick satisfaction watching this happen. Like waiting for it, as a deputy director, his mother, they know exactly who his mother is. And they know the implication when her son applies for a Russian visa and makes his way to a training camp. What's sad to me is if he didn't know that the Russians would value the propaganda victory and uncomfortable headlines brought by his death and the grief that brings to his parents far more than anything he could have done for them on the battlefield. That was just sort of an especially dark thought that I had of what could have been going on there around him, and that he thought he was doing something that he was being. The people around him had ulterior motives,
Yeah. What is it? Like with the people I've met in the conspiracy movement, because it's very easy to paint conspiracy theorists as just lunatics, but a lot of them just deep down care, and they just care a bit too much.
Yeah.
And they're generally quite sensitive people, and because the world is so full of contradictions and hypocrisy, and then we tend to overly focus on our own hypocrisy, it can lead people down a path of supporting other people like Russia, etc. So it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. But it's the other thing as well. Just as you were talking, I'm just thinking to myself, it's almost impossible they didn't know who he was, unless it was a huge intelligence failure.
There is no way that Russia is not acutely aware of all of the senior leadership at Langley, know who their immediate family members are, know that one of their children, their son, is sort of marinating in this sort of Russian propaganda conspiracy swamp, and then applies for a Russian visa. And, that comes up. Okay, this American, there's no way. There's no way the Russians did not know exactly who he was. And they're smart enough to know that what the headlines would be and what we would be talking about and how it would look. Deputy CIA director's son killed fighting for the Russians in Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's what they got out of this, and that's exactly what they wanted.
Yeah.
I just find that especially dark and heinous. I don't think he knew that, but they did.
No. And now he's dead. And the family are grieving. And it's all pretty horrific.
It feels like an op.
It does feel like an op.
I'm going to take your kid from you, and you're going to watch it.
Kind of reminds me of Smiley's people a little bit.
It's very Carla. I mean, I didn't want to. I was thinking Carla too. I was thinking like, do I want to apply fiction to this? But no, it feels like an op.
Yeah, because if you read the book, it's all about how Smiley has to exploit Carla's disabled daughter, I think, to get Carla to come out of the shadows so they can get him.
I'm not saying this was something to like recruit his mother or something. I'm not going there at all. As far as like the counterintelligence thing, I don't think that at all. I mean, yeah, she would have been interviewed by the FBI, I think, as soon as they had confirmation he was in Ukraine and stuff. And, but I don't think it goes for her. I don't think it goes any farther than that. I think it was just, we have your son. He's ours now.
Yeah. That's pretty fucked up.
Yeah.
But so sorry to end the podcast, I suppose, on such a cheery story, but it's I just thought it was one that was worth bringing up as well because it was such a fascinating one and tragic.
Very sad.
And it just shows the kind of human cost of the intelligence game a little bit, really, doesn't it?
Yep.
So
Yep.
I think we've covered a lot of ground there. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Sorry for ending on such a dark note there. Definitely wasn't quite my intention, but it's difficult sometimes, this topic, to not talk about the darkness. So
it's the reality of the intelligence business, and I think a lot of times, when we talk about like the geopolitics and the maneuvering and all that kind of stuff, it stays very much at like a 30,000-foot level. But sometimes this stuff gets really nasty and really personal and really dark. That's the nature of the business. There's a lot of people listening I know that much better than I do. I just that's just what I see in this story right here.
Yeah, indeed. Well, keep an eye on your loved ones, keep them close, because online radicalization can happen to anybody. The most intelligent, most successful people can fall for it as much as anything else. You don't have to be having a crisis necessarily to fall to it. So, I mean, look at what happened during COVID and the amount of people who completely lost their minds over that. It was a crisis at the time, but a lot of people really lost it, and some people have not ever really kind of come back from that. So
now we're dealing with the consequences of that every day, and we will probably for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, indeed. So definitely be cautious out there with your online behavior and what your loved ones are up to. So anyway, on that lovely cheery note, we'll wrap things up. But thank you very much for listening. Connect with us on social media. Our links are all in the show notes, as are the articles that we've discussed today. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do share it. Sharing really helps us sort of grow our audience, because we're getting, I feel like the podcast is really growing nicely. We've done, we've just been, prior to this recording, reflecting on things, because we kind of ramped things up in January, and we definitely have seen some growth on the podcast, which is fantastic. So, thank you very much, everybody out there, for listening to us and supporting us. And I hope that you feel we're providing value for you.
Can I make an ask to that point? If folks are listening and they agree with the sentiments that you just expressed, I'll greatly appreciate it if you go on and leave us a lovely review.
Oh yeah.
Often we get them right. Often we get them. It's not folks who listen all the time. It's people who sort of don't know and tune in, and they hear something that they're not used to it and they don't like, and then they're like, bad, But if that's not you, give us a shout. Show us some love. It really helps a lot. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah. We haven't had a review in a while. Should we say a review from somebody who actually listens in a while? And this is a weird psychology of the negative review.
I think a lot of those folks who are listening and do like it, rather than, they just come to us and say it.
Yeah.
Or they send an email
wonderful.
or something or whatever. But that also, that helps a lot too. Appreciate it.
Well, it's it, and I feel like we've had a really nice growing interaction over the last few months. I've really appreciated
sure.
it, and
I love it.
we'll definitely be doing another listener questions at the end of this month as well, because now we're in a brand new sparkling month. It's May, so it's like time is marching on. So drop us an email at secretsandspiespodcast@gmail.com if you do have any questions that you'd like us to read out at the end of May. And then obviously just tell us how you'd like to be credited on there, and if there's a specific topic you want us to talk about, do share us a link as well so we can read what you've read and figure out where you're kind of coming from. So I think we'll wrap things up. So thank you very much everybody for listening, and have a great weekend, and we'll catch you next week. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.